Alright, before we go into this weekend's new releases, as I mentioned in other videos, I kind of wanted to catch up on a lot of the new releases that we missed for this year that mainly went to streaming and various streaming platforms, and just kind of touch on them like two at a time rather than doing like the whole group videos that I usually do. I just imagine it's easier that way. And the two that I wanted to start with were these two, both of which probably had a lot of potential going in, and may or may not have delivered much at all on either on either movie on that potential. So I want to start with Project Power, which is this really big Netflix movie that had like an $85 million budget or something, and had really big faces attached to it with Jamie Foxx and Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And as we've seen, this is kind of Joseph Gordon-Levitt's kind of resurgence after he took a break for about 4 years there, because he did 7500 earlier, and then after this he's got the Aaron Sorkin movie in October, I think. So this is kind of the middle of that, and he's kind of hitting like he's kind of hitting all the different sort of areas. And in here we've kind of got the not so much a blockbuster type, but like a replacement blockbuster type, where it's the guys that did it's like the Catfish guys, and they did like Nerve, Henry Joost and Ariel Schulman, and those guys with Nerve did something that really annoyed me, and it kind of comes through in this movie also. And that's the whole idea of getting, because you have to really look out when you do like the high concept thing. And this is not just Nerve. We've talked about this endlessly, of course, in the past, but the idea that when you have this really, really big concept, you kind of tend to get married to that concept, and then you don't really jump off of it. Like you're really, like you get so wrapped up in, oh, this is what the big concept's going to be, this is how we're going to market it, and all the exposition's going to be explaining the concept, and it's going to be really cool and creative. But then you have a movie to do after that, and they tend to have trouble finding that footing. The writer, kind of scarily, is the guy that's writing the Batman, the Matt Reeves, Robert Pattinson Batman movie that's coming up. So this is that kind of thing. This is that kind of Hollywood thing that begs you the question, like, so how does one get that job from this mediocre movie that hadn't even come out yet when they were making the Batman? But that's the way it goes. So when it starts, it already feels a bit fractured. We've got our supposed villain in Rodrigo Santoro, and you might remember him as he was Xerxes in 300, or he was Laura Linney's love interest in Love Actually. Very different places he's coming from. And he's having a run-in with Machine Gun Kelly. And they introduce the pills that make up the concept of this movie that everybody loves so much. The whole, you take one of these pills and you have superpowers for 5 minutes. And I think the immediate stopping point here to make, like, there's always a point in time in these high concept movies early on where you say, oh, so that's what they're doing. Oh, I feel misled. That sucks. And then the rest of the movie's underwhelming. The concept kind of made it sound like you would have, like you could take the pill and you don't know, like, the superpowers are like individual to the pill rather than the person. So when you take the pill, you don't know what the fuck's gonna happen. But no, they're individual to the person, which means the power, I guess, is already in you or something, because when you take the pill, it's that power for you specifically, and it's just that one power. So, great. Uh, so it's like, oh, we gotta have a really high concept, but we can't be too creative. We gotta pull it back just a little bit, because we don't want to think too much. We want to think before we start writing, and then when we actually start writing, we don't want to think anymore. So, yeah. And this opening scene, when I say it felt fractured with Machine Gun Kelly and Rodrigo Santoro, is that, well, first off, if you're like me, your immediate reaction to Machine Gun Kelly might be to, like, roll your eyes. That could just be the Eminem fan in me. But he's actually not a terrible actor, because he was also in Bird Box, and I think he's popped up in a couple of other things. And he's not a terrible actor, but the I can't even tell if it's the dialogue or the editing, to be honest with you, because they're talking and it feels like dialogue is missing. Like when Shingon Kelly's like talking to him and he's asking him questions about this shipment or whatever, and the guy says, "You ask a lot of questions." And Machine Gun Kelly's response to "you ask a lot of questions" is to introduce himself by name. So I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if there was more dialogue in there that was like cut out awkwardly, or if that's just the way it was written. But either way, it's not doing the movie any favors. To start off with, it might seem like a small, minuscule thing, but this is the first scene of the movie. This is setting the mood for everything. So, yeah, that's I don't know. And there's a whole lot of... They kind of give up on this about halfway through, thankfully, but there's also a big thing here in this opening scene as well as the entire first half, really, where they love doing a camera tilt kind of zoom thing. So they're trying really, really hard to be flashy about the whole thing, as you can tell, but when the concept itself is flashy enough, to where it's almost like if it had almost been done in more of a grounded style, that might have added an interesting quality to it, where you kind of have like a grounded style, but everything else is like really over the top. But it kind of feels like it might not be over the top enough. Like it goes in, it gets, it falls into generic action movie pretty quickly. So with a concept like this, that's all the more like why you clearly have more. Why not? Because it's also one of those cases where I can't tell if. I mean, you can say this about everything, especially Netflix movies, but you get the vibe that they're trying to set up something, like they're trying to build up to another movie or something, or multiple movies or something. Sort of like, I felt a lot of Bright in this movie. I don't know if that's just the Netflix quality, or the having a concept that's really interesting and creative, and then just making a not-so-great movie out of it. Making a generic movie with a background that's so sort of unique to its own thing, but alright. But I think another big stopping point here is that what we've talked about many, many times before, sometimes it works, most of the time it doesn't. Like 98% of the time it doesn't. And that is having this whole storyline going on. You've got cops, you've got criminals, you've got all this stuff going on. So what's really the last thing you need to put in the middle of this to add conflict? Put a kid. Attach a kid to one of them. And that's almost always a death curse, and here it's not really that different. Even though the kid is... It feels like for a while the kid is the main character, so maybe that's handling it a little differently, but at the same time, this kid's characteristics are not that intriguing. The main one seems to be that they want to be a rapper. So there are just scenes of them rapping. And I don't... because here's the thing, is it's like, I can see them going for like a unique character trait in the way that they use it, but there's a point in time, especially when she's in school, and there's this whole sequence where she raps like on the teacher, and it's this big spectacle of a thing, and you're like, wow, this got really ridiculous really fast, where it basically turns into a music video. And to the movie's credit, just a tiny, tiny bit, that ends up being a fantasy sequence, so it's not as dumb as it could have been, but at the same time, you look at this and you see how it factors into this character and the rest of what's going on here, and you're like, they only did this rapping thing for one reason and one reason only: to make the movie longer. Because these scenes feel like they have nothing to do with anything. Like I said, they seem like they're supposed to really be significant to her character. Which, as long as that's the case, you don't need to be relevant to necessarily the big picture. As long as you're building a character, then you can still be doing something. But it just feels like it goes nowhere. The only thing it's here for, apart from to make the movie longer, is to give us an end credit sequence that tonally makes no fucking sense. So there that is. And the pacing is also like really off, because this is the kind of movie where you would think if you have a whole array of characters that can just have superpowers at the drop of a hat, even if only for 5 minutes, this is the kind of especially being an action movie, this is the kind of movie that should move like a bullet. Like this is like completely set up to be this really fast-paced, almost non-stop action sort of thing, but it feels so long. Like it's one of those cases where you have it on Netflix and you feel like you're a good chunk of it down, and you look and you're like 35 minutes in. And it's like that seems to be the death mark, is 35 minutes in. That's usually, it almost seems like that's always where it is when you're watching a poorly paced movie and you feel like you're far into it. It's always 35 minutes. So that's kind of a downfall to it also. But to its credit, when those action sequences do come, they're pretty decent for the most part. Like the effects leave something to be desired, but once they go bigger, that's, yeah. But like when they're smaller, like this whole sequence where Joseph Gordon-Levitt is chasing a dude that has like chameleon like powers, like he keeps blending into everything he like runs by, is a really cool and effective effect. But it's, and so those are few and far between. As they get bigger, like I said, the effects get worse. But there is another action scene that actually, it almost seems like they're breaking a cardinal rule of action, but it actually works for the most part. And that is to be like, almost like put a barrier between the audience and the action, where it's, they have this woman in like a tank, and they're testing, like, you know, to see what kind of power, or something to that effect. I watched the movie like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I'm like trying to remember everything. But this power is going horribly, horribly wrong. And it's, so as this really intense thing is happening inside this tank, there's an action scene, like a big action scene going on outside of it. And we stay in the tank the whole time. And we're watching the action scene like through the glass as this effect is going horribly awry, as this power is going horribly awry. And so that was interesting, and like I said, it gives it sort of a, you get a sense where they had some sort of creative vision sometimes. The problem is that it's just not, you know, the whole movie, where you can see those moments of inspiration. So, but as far as character work goes, for the most part, it's fine coming from like Jamie Foxx and Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and it's, what's really great is they spend about a little over an hour of the first a little over an hour of the movie not like apart. And so it's actually genuinely exciting when we're like over an hour into the movie and their characters finally meet. So there was something like that. Like I said, there are sparks in this movie that really say, like, you know, you get a glimpse of what it probably could have been. But for the most part, it just almost feels like lazy, and there's not a lot of, like, all the developments are like underwhelming or practically non-existent. There's, like I said, there's one villain, then there's also another villain, but there's nothing particularly, it feels like there's hardly much of an end goal for a long time. Which is a problem. And it's also got, obviously trying to go for like a sort of blockbustery vibe. There's going to be comedic beats also, but I can't really think of any of those that landed. And there's some that are like really blatant, like there's a moment towards the end during the climax when it's that old joke where Joseph Gordon-Levitt has a mission and he goes one way, but then he actually needs to go the other way, so it's just weird. Especially in the climax when we should be past the comedic beats stuff. So there's that. I almost forgot that Courtney B. Vance is in this movie. And he's another case where you feel like his character is going to be like really important or significant, and he might have a link to something, or he might not. We don't really know, because we don't really go into it. So so a real big waste of Courtney B. Vance. But as far as, like, you know, Jamie Foxx and Joseph Gordon-Levitt having stuff to work with, they're fine. They obviously really could have used better material, but they did what they could with what they had here. So yeah, that's really all that there is to this. It's just another case of a really high concept movie that just really didn't do much of anything with it. Doesn't have any exciting developments, or doesn't really have a case of you don't really know where it's going to go next, because you're not really asking yourself where it's going to go next, because you really just don't give a fuck. So it just kind of is, and it really, really wants to coast on its concept. But there's just something kind of empty about it, and it tries to have, big emotional payoffs by the end, but it's like these come in so late, and when they do, not necessarily late, because they give us little, hints at it. But those are so vague when they happen. It's one of those cases where you can tell they're being vague for the sake of being vague, to try to pull the audience in and try to make the audience, want to know what's going to happen. But you can just already tell, like, right away what those are and what they signify, and it's like, once you already kind of know where it's going and where those little hints are actually taking you, it's just like, yeah, the movie's just stalling now. The movie's just trying to be nearly 2 hours. And that's not even to include the wrapping thing, so yeah. So that's what Project Power is. I try to say the title as much as I can, because I keep wanting to call it Project Mayhem by accident. So yeah, it's just there. It's yet another big budget Netflix movie that's just fucking there. Like I said, much like Bright. And speaking of Bright, let's talk about David Ayer. Because David Ayer did a new movie called The Tax Collector. And this is David Ayer for sure, but David Ayer is so hit and miss with me. And it's like his hits really, really hit, and his misses really, really fucking miss. It's like there's no middle ground with this dude. And it's like the movies he just simply writes are usually stellar. Like, he wrote Training Day, he wrote SWAT. I love SWAT. And then he started getting into directing with, he had Harsh Times with Christian Bale, which is a movie that I liked at the time, but I don't think I've watched it since I was a teenager, so which is the prime age to love David Ayer movies. But but the thing is I remember, even though I remember liking this at the time, it basically felt like he was just doing Training Day again, only he was getting the chance to direct it. But there's also knockoff David Ayer movies. Like, they're knockoff Training Day movies, but they also feel like knockoff just David Ayer movies in general. Like this Cuba Gooding Jr. movie, Dirty, which is basically the straight-to-video Training Day. But the thing is these actually feel like knockoff David Ayer movies, to the point that it's when The Tax Collector comes along, I'm having a hard time telling the difference between David Ayer and knockoff David Ayer. Like, if you were to just watch, like, The Tax Collector or Bright or something, you would automatically assume that David Ayer made this movie as well. Because it's almost like he's taken instead of following, like, Antoine Fuqua or Clark Johnson, the directors of Training Day and SWAT, he wanted to go to the direction of the people that knocked off the movies he wrote when he became a director. So and that's basically what we have here. So immediately we start with a little bit of, well, not so much misdirection, because the poster makes this apparent, but when you hear about, like, when you hear the first news about this movie, the big thing was, it was going to be a David Ayer movie, and Shia LaBeouf was going to be in it. And they worked so well together in Fury. I love Fury so much. It is incredible. So it was very exciting that they were going to be working together again, because obviously Shia is amazing in Fury as well, on top of the whole movie. But it turns out that he's playing a side character, and the main character is a relative unknown. Bobby Soto, I think is his name. And that's where we are. So it's like, okay, you can kind of see the promise, and you kind of salivate at the idea of, like, oh, David Ayer is working with Shia LaBeouf again. This has to be good. And, like, there has to be something here. But then it's almost like instantaneous. Like, the second you realize Shia's playing a secondary character, you're like, oh, and the main actor is an unknown. Okay, well, it's not like this hasn't worked before, but I'm nervous about the quality of this. So it's like, does this relative unknown have talent? you might be quick to see this movie and jump on the idea of saying, oh my god, that guy's a terrible lead, he's a charisma black hole, he's got nothing to offer, or whatever. I don't think, based solely on this movie, that Bobby Soto's a bad actor, but there's just something so... It's so hard to get invested in really any of the characters in this movie. It's just kind of hard to tell. Like where this, it's kind of like Project Power. It's kind of hard to tell where exactly it failed, because there's certainly writing problems. There's definitely acting problems. The actress playing the main character's wife is fucking awful. So that makes like the whole sort of, we're doing the thing here where the main character is a criminal, so we have to make him likable and root for him. So we'll just give him a wife and kids. And it's one of those scripts that basically stops at that. It's like, you have to like the guy now, no matter what he does and what he partakes in, because he's got a wife and kids. And so that's not the best way to go. And so when we do have these scenes, and there's a lot of scenes that are just him talking to his wife, and it's like, you can tell this is where we're supposed to get invested. This is where the emotion is. This is probably where Ayer would say is the heart of the movie, if I had to guess. And these scenes just have no impact whatsoever because the writing is dull, the performances just aren't in it, and we just don't give a fuck about these people. Which is really bad when we get to like the second half and the stakes are getting really, really high. And it's like, it's great when you are watching a movie and in the second half the stakes get really, really high to the point that you can tell. But it's almost worse when you can see that the stakes are getting high, but you can feel how much you don't care. And it's like, literally nothing that happens in this second half is going to move me or make me react really in any way whatsoever, regardless of what's happening. And you can see here pulling out all the stops in this second half. But like the feelings towards anything and anybody are just not there at all. Because you can see like if you look at the relationship between the main character and Shia's character, you really, really get the vibe of like it's almost like it's End of Watch, another one of his movies, on the other side of the law, basically. So we get the banter that we saw between Jake Gyllenhaal and Michael Pena, only it's now Bobby Soto and Shia LaBeouf, and like it feels exactly the same kind of banter. And they're, joking around with each other, they go to work, they get back in the car, they joke around with each other, they get back to work, etc. Only instead of, cops, now they're, collecting things for Jimmy Smiths. And, and that's basically what, collecting money for Jimmy Smiths, who is in prison, and trying to basically conduct things from there. But then there's another crime boss that comes in, and they have to deal with him, and there's kind of a plot there, somewhat, and that's what the movie is. And then, of course, things start to escalate and escalate and escalate. And as far as Shia's character goes, because obviously he's the main selling point here, he's the most interesting character. He's the guy that's like the, the loose cannon, the rabid dog character. And it's a character we've seen a lot, but it's a character that I really feel he's capable of playing. And you can tell that he did as much as he possibly could with the material. Like I said, sometimes the filmmaking just comes into play here, and you just don't kind of know what to think. Because we've got this scene towards the beginning where we're basically going to establish the kind of character that Shia is, and just how threatening he is. So the guy's saying, like, hey, man, I don't have the money yet, if you could just give me a little more time, maybe I could, whatever. And so Shia takes off his sunglasses, and you can see that look in his eye, and he's like, just look me in the eyes, and, to basically threaten him into saying, give us the fucking money right now, or we will kill you. And so we get a cut when he's looking into Shia's eyes, and it's a shot of him in, like a suit to, like, keep from getting blood on him, and he's dragging a dude by like a belt that's wrapped around the dude's neck, and it's just this quick cut to basically show us, like, it's almost like it's meant to signify when he looks into Shia's eyes, he sees what Shia's capable of. So we as the audience get this shot of, something he's probably done to some dude in the past that didn't pay up. And I can see where that idea could work. Like, I could see, like, what maybe he was going for there. But it's just so awkward. Like, the way it's cut so suddenly, it almost feels like... It almost feels like that scene of him dragging that guy was like a deleted scene. And Ayer was like, well, I really like that shot, and I really want it in the movie, so it's like, why don't we do this thing where it's like, hey, we'll put it in here when he says, look me in the eyes, and it's like, you can never... There's a lot of moments in this movie where you can't tell if we're cutting to a new scene entirely, or if we're just cutting to something that signifies something, and then we cut back to the scene we're at. There's so much of that through the whole thing. I don't know what the editing, like, what the editor was smoking here, but it's... And I get that this is another one of those movies that tries to use editing, and it's a very, very straight-to-video use of editing, where it's like, you want everything to feel really intense. You want the audience to feel like there's a lot of stakes, so just edit everywhere, especially in gunfights. You know, shake the camera a little bit, do all that stuff. It's so very straight-to-video, you would almost never suspect. If you were already familiar with this style, you would almost never suspect this is from an established director. But here we are. So, and obviously there's a lot of, like, this is where the whole movie is like this, absolutely. But Shaw in particular has a really thin line here that he has to be careful of, where, in true David Ayer fashion, the movie is trying way too hard to be, like, hardcore. Where it's like, there's such a thin line between actually being badass and just being, like, cringy. And Ayer is always on that line. Like, constant. That's where David Ayer lives on that line. And more often than not, lately he falls on the cringe side, obviously, and most of this movie does that as well. And it's like I was joking about with Harsh Times, it's like being a teenager is the prime age to love David Ayer movies. Like these. Like, sometimes he feels a bit more... Like, Fury felt a lot more, like, mature compared to some of his other movies. But this is just... Yeah, like, that's just him in a nutshell. It's just trying way too hard for the most part. Trying way too hard to be way too graphically violent. There's a scene towards the end where he takes a page out of S. Craig Zoller's book for the worst. And if you've seen the other videos, you know how I feel about him. There's a point in time that's hilarious towards the end, because the end's trying super, super hard to be badass. Like, the entire last half of the movie, basically all of the dialogue is the word fuck. Like, that's... Like, it's like, hey, you know, hey, you know, banter with Shia, hey, you know, talking to my wife, hey, talking to all these people at a birthday party, scenes with George Lopez, and then in the last 45 minutes, the script just becomes fuck, and that's all it is. Fuck, and gunfire. And what's hilarious about this also is about it trying to be badass about itself, is there is a shootout towards the end where they burst into the room, and it goes into slow-mo, and just everybody's firing guns in slow-mo. But the thing that makes this so laughable is that it's supposed to be this big, huge, badass moment where everybody's shooting at each other, and it's in slow-mo. But the way the camera goes across, their faces are really prominent in the shot also, and despite all this supposed badassery going on of guns going off in slow-mo, all their faces are just neutral. And it's... it's so, like, unintentionally hilarious of a moment. Like, I couldn't get over it after I saw it. It was hilarious. But, I mentioned George Lopez a little bit ago. And I do like his presence here. I don't know what it is about him. Maybe the fact that Nick at Night has been playing his show constantly for like 15 years, and no matter when you open your eyes in the middle of the night, he and his sitcom family will be there. At some point in this, like, however many years that's been going on, I remember it specifically long ago crossing my mind what he would be like in a movie like this, or a part like this, and I kind of always wanted to see it. And in the little bit we get here, I feel like he would be really great with this. The trouble is that he gets so little screen time. Like, I really wish... This is one of those instances where I really wish George Lopez had more screen time in a movie. Because obviously he's played, not necessarily parts like this, but almost villainy parts in, like, comedies. And it's like, I really think he could really, you know, take a bite out of something like this. But he's barely got any screen time, so that was kind of disappointing, because I'd love to see him have, like, a real big role like this. I think he'd actually... I know that sounds outlandish, but I honestly really think he could do it. And like I said, there's total promise here, and the little screen time he has. Trouble is, this is just too little amount of screen time, so I would really like to have seen more of him. So, yeah, that's basically what it is. When it's not trying too hard to be hardcore and graphically violent, it's doing the whole thing of, you know, the audience must invest because he has a family. And it's just, and there's, like, all those scenes, whether it be the violence or the family scenes, they all feel equally empty. Because we get what they're going for here, but none of the impact is there at all. So, that's basically where this is. So, both of these movies pretty much leave me feeling the same way. I don't really feel anything whatsoever, but I feel like there's a good movie in both of them somewhere. It's much harder to find in The Tax Collector. Like, you really, really have to dig to say, I think I see some potential in The Tax Collector, but, really, actually, that's only in, like, the before they even really did anything. Like, you just hear David Ayer, Shia LaBeouf doing a movie like this. And the whole storyline of following them and what it is that they do, like collecting payments for a crime boss and all that, there's absolutely something here. And you can actually see... You hear that and you can actually imagine him going back to his Training Day roots. But the great thing about Training Day was, like, every new turn was so enthralling. Not to mention you had that Denzel performance, and Ethan Hawke, also. And it's like, every time there was a new development on Alonzo's character, you got more and more pulled in and invested. And, like, it's like, along with Ethan Hawke's character, Jake, you just kind of kept going down this rabbit hole. And he's never quite been able to capture that, despite how many times Training Day has been copied, whether by him himself or somebody else. So you never get that vibe in The Tax Collector, but I feel like that's the thing, is you could go down such a rabbit hole of, like, you know, debauchery or whatever, but instead it's like, oh, there's this crime boss that's the threat, and then that's basically what the movie is. And there's no, like, further developments much at all. Like I said, they do things to, like, grab the audience's attention and say anything can happen, but who cares? By that point. So, that's where we get landed there. So, I think the next one after this is going to be the new releases of this week, which will be Mulan, and I'm thinking of Ending Things. And then I'll go into some more new releases that we missed, kind of paired up like this throughout the weeks of this month. So, I think that's where I'm going to leave this. So until that, I think that's it for this.